Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, I'm Sandy Quinn. I'm president of the Richard Nixon Foundation, and I welcome you all here today. Please welcome Congressman Ed Royce, who we just sat there. Congressman, as always, we're honored to have you here, as we are all of you. We're gathered because it is the 101st birthday of the 37th president. And every year we do a ceremony, a program. We do a wreath laying because the president, in this instance, of course, President Obama, sends a personal wreath, and we place that wreath symbolically as a laying of the wreath to mark the president's acknowledgement of his predecessor and his birthday. So we'll do that. And Congressman Royce will lead that, joined by Admiral Lorge. And we have a main speaker today who this week, Simon & Schuster just released a wonderful, vivid, lively biography called Pat and Dick, which is a story about the Nixon's marriage. There's been so many books about Richard Nixon and the administration and accomplishments and Watergate and so on. This is an interesting new look at not only Richard Nixon, but his lovely wife, Pat Nixon. He was, of course, in the Navy and served in the South Pacific. Today we're going to begin with the presentation of the colors. Please stand for the presentation from the 1st Marine Division at Camp Pendleton. Thank you. To give the Pledge of Allegiance, I want to introduce a youngster who has climbed the highest mountains. Tyler Armstrong, please come up. Tyler is 9 years old. Tyler climbed Mount Whitney, which is 14,496 feet high. I've done that. But he not only did that, he climbed Mount Kilimanjaro, 19,000 feet. I have not done that. And he's the youngest ever to climb Mount Aconcagua, the tallest mountain in the southern and western hemisphere. Richard Nixon climbed high mountains after he was born here right on this property in Yorba Linda. This young fellow, imagine what high mountains he'll climb throughout his life. And next, he's doing Mount McKinley. That's what he hopes to do next. He climbs to raise money for an awareness for Duchenne muscular dystrophy disease. His family's here, his dad, Kevin, his mom, Priscilla, his brother, Dylan. Ladies and gentlemen, Tyler Armstrong for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. Hand over your heart. Ready, begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tyler. Good job, Tyler. All right. Let's thank these great young men from the Marine Corps, Camp Pendleton. Thank you, guys. Please be seated. Now, ladies and gentlemen, for the invocation, I'd like to introduce Chaplain Robert Poussin. He's a Navy captain. He's been a chaplain for 27 years. Chaplain?
Let us pray. Dear Commander-in-Chief of the universe, husband, father, wartime naval officer, congressman, senator, vice president, president, and elder statesman, President Nixon did it all with incredible distinction and selfless dedication. Coming from the humblest of beginnings, this man found greatness the hard way, the right way, and the quintessentially American way. He earned it. His election to student body president at nearby Whittier College was but a harbinger of things to come. And as our president, only this proven patriot and global visionary could be trusted to extend the hand of friendship to the People's Republic of China. And in so doing, he changed the world and forever changed the course of history. Inheriting America's long war in Vietnam, a war not of his making, with a steely principled determination, he would settle for nothing less than a just and honorable peace. Domestically, his bold initiatives created opportunities for the least of these, your children, the poor, the downtrodden, and the disenfranchised. And in a vocation where many take such vows lightly, he was a devoted husband to the singular love of his life, Pat, and father to their beloved daughters, Tricia and Julie, whose own lives have brought honor to their parents' legacy. And in his post-presidential years, this man never cashed in on the office. Rather, he continued to wrestle with the big issues and produce the big ideas. Quietly and without fanfare, he became a trusted advisor to presidents who would follow across party lines. Finally, in the words of the great poet Rudyard Kipling, President Nixon could meet with both triumph and disaster and treat those two imposters just the same. For sharing this incredibly gifted and giving leader, a leader whose stature rises with each passing year, we offer our heartfelt thanks to you, O God, the author and finisher of every good gift. Amen.
That's the Navy Region Southwest Band. They played a concert here at 1 o'clock. You'll hear from them a few times during the program. Thank you for coming, guys. We appreciate that. I want you to meet a few of our VIPs, and I'll start with our own mayor from Yorba Linda. He went to China with us in May and spent 10 days retracing President Nixon's steps through Beijing and Hangzhou and Shanghai. Our good friend of the city of Yorba Linda and of the Nixon family, Craig Young, Mayor Young. Mayor Pro Tem Jean Hernandez. Where are you, Jean? Jean Hernandez, right there. And former mayor and now councilman, still a councilman, Tom Lindsay. Tom, thank you for coming. The longtime friend of the Nixon family, Lois Lundberg. Lois, where are you? Please stand. I think she's there. Yeah. Now, we operated the Nixon Library for 18 years as the Nixon Foundation, and then we decided it was best if we joined with the National Archives, who operate all the presidential libraries in one big system around the country, because we wanted to have all of the presidential papers and documents and films and so forth in one place, so that people could come to the birthplace, the community where he was born, see the memorial sites, the birthplace, tour the galleries, and also research the papers, all in one location. So we joined with the National Archives. We were with them 2 nights ago at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., where we celebrated the President's January 9th birthday, but with a gathering of the extended Nixon family in the Washington area. And David Ferriot, the United States Archivist, was there and said great things about our relationship and what we look forward to doing. So representing the archivist and she is the new Deputy Director of this library. Please welcome Deputy Director Ida Kelly.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Sandy. And I'd like to thank everyone at the Nixon Foundation who organized this great event, and to thank you all for coming here to celebrate the life and legacy of President Richard Nixon. As Sandy said, I am the new Deputy Director of the Presidential Library and Museum. I'm not even a month on the job. I grew up in LA. I'm a fellow San Fernando Valley resident, as with Sandy. But I've been in Washington for 18 years, and I've been in federal service for 15. And I'm delighted to come back to home. So I'm here to stay in Orange County. I'm also equally delighted. I'm new to the National Archives. As Sandy indicated, the Presidential Library System, and there's 13 of them, and you're familiar with Reagan out in Simi Valley, is our nation's keeper of our most precious documents. It's part of our heritage, our Constitution, Bill of Rights, and so forth in D.C. And this is part of the same system. With that, in my new role, I really do look forward to building strong relationships and stronger relationships between the archives and the foundation as we work on new exhibits and public programs and future projects, and so much more to come. We want you to come many times. I know many of you repeat visitors, and so we look forward to seeing you back as well. Over the past 2 years, we have commemorated the Pat Nixon and Richard Nixon centennial exhibits. If you haven't already, please go to the Great Room. It's phenomenal, the exhibit hall. And we plan to find new ways to reach younger audiences and generations. And for example, just this past year, we had over 10,000 students from neighboring school districts come through. So it's part of our mission to make sure that this history continues. The library is truly a treasure for everyone interested in learning about the life and times of Richard Nixon. As I've said, this is kind of a really unique kind of oasis here of research and material. The presidency of Richard Nixon is one of the best documented administrations in American history. The materials that we have here, just to throw out some numbers, We have approximately 4,000 recordings of broadcast video, 4,500 audio recordings, 24,000 items. You can imagine the types of artifacts and dresses and paraphernalia from the presidency, of which 1,000 are about from foreign heads of state gifts. 300,000 still photographs, 2 million feet of film, 46 million pages of documents, and 3,700 hours of recorded presidential conversations. And what's wonderful is one of our speakers coming up, Will Swift, used those resources, and so he'll talk a little bit about the historical archives that he used that obviously went into his research. With that, I just want to thank you all for coming here to commemorate the 101st birthday and to learn more about all of the President's accomplishments and the impact that he continues to have on our lives today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ada. It is a tradition at all of these presidential birthday observances that the incumbent president, President Obama, send a representative, send a wreath from the White House. And this year he chose Admiral Patrick Lorge, who will not only participate in the wreath laying, but would like to offer remarks at this time. Admiral? He is a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy. He is a naval aviator. Probably to become an admiral, you'd have to be an operator as well. He flies them all. The Hornet, the Tomcat, he's flown them all. He also has the Defense Superior Service Medal and the Legion of Merit. Admiral, thank you.
Good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for coming here. It is with great pleasure that I am here with you today, and I would like to share this very special occasion with you. And I was specifically asked to briefly acknowledge President Nixon's legacy to our armed services, and I hope I give him justice in these small remarks. Richard Milhouse Nixon, our 37th Commander-in-Chief, the Red Hunter, a Quaker. He could have easily requested an exemption from military service, but he did not. Instead, in the middle of World War II, he joined the Navy. Originally assigned to a naval station in Ottumwa, Iowa, he was not satisfied with that position, and he requested and received a transfer to the South Pacific Theater, where he served as an aviation ground officer. When many may have sought to avoid service and sacrifice, Richard Nixon did not. He was a man from the greatest generation of men and a leader of that generation. A man who took great pride in the American way of life and sought to preserve those ideals by serving his country. For his anti-communist efforts during his tenure in the House and Senate, he became appropriately known as the Red Hunter. His fervent and unrelenting anti-communist reputation helped him become the vice president under Dwight Eisenhower. Richard Nixon was also a statesman who greatly appreciated the value of having our military's presence and commitment on other continents and around the world. He understood that the prosperity of our nation enjoys its interdependence with our position in the global hierarchy, and he established a reputation as an internationalist in foreign policy. He reduced tensions with China and the Soviet Union through laborious diplomacy. And yet he also recognized that his own country was deeply divided by the war in Vietnam. And ultimately, under his watch, that ceasefire agreement was signed with North Vietnam. And after having seen the reduced numbers of forces on the ground in Vietnam, it was most that he contributed to the military that we have today. President Nixon believed in a highly professional, self-motivated, and skilled military. It was Richard Nixon who set the tone of how we recruit and keep an all-volunteer force. He understood that the discipline problems of the day could most often be directly attributed to the draftees that we had, and they're not wanting to be there sometimes. Now, many disagreed with him on an all-volunteer force and argued with him that the country could never sustain that force. But I would submit to you that the last 12 years and 40 years have shown that we can do that and do it with aplomb. The fine sailors and Marines you see before you and just recently are a tribute to Richard Nixon and his idea. 40 years after the establishment of that all-volunteer force, it makes us the envy of every country in the world. We demand a higher level of educational achievement and demonstration of good judgment for almost all of our recruits, and that is not true of the population at large. During the Nixon administration, veterans' education's benefits expanded as funding levels increased and numbers of veterans entering higher education rose correspondingly. And President Nixon's accomplishments while in office still influence our Navy and all branches of our armed services today. And that all-volunteer force that some question, what has it done? Well, here we stand, and like we said, since the 90s, the Persian Gulf War, the last 12 years in both Iraq and Afghanistan, we have done it, and we have done it well. The young men and women fighting our nation's battles today are the finest, most gung-ho, energized people in this country. They are patriots, and they are smart. And they are a legacy to our 37th president, President Richard Milhouse Nixon. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, for the formal wreath laying, we're having Congressman Royce and the Admiral. And prior to that, I've asked Congressman Royce if he would say a few words. He's chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And to introduce him, I've asked our Mayor, Craig Young. Mayor, would you come forward?
Thank you, Sandy. Community welcome. We are so grateful that you're here and that you're here to celebrate the 101st birthday of President Richard Nixon. Yorba Linda is privileged to house one, as have you heard earlier, only 13 presidential libraries in the entire country. And in addition to all the documents, the thousands of archives that you heard earlier, this venue also is privileged to bring celebrities of a variety of notorieties to the stage and others throughout the grounds here. In just the last couple months alone, I've had the privilege of meeting with Vice President Dick Cheney, Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld, Governor Mike Huckabee, and many other national and international leaders. Before I introduce, if I could take just a second for a commercial, I think membership in the library is probably one of the best returns on investment. A mere $50 is the lowest you can invest in to be a member here. One of the best ROIs you can have in the entire country. So I'd encourage you to consider membership. It is my distinct honor to introduce a local hero, a local hero who needs really no introduction for those of us who are here. Congressman Ed Royce of the 39th District, as Sandy has just said, is chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He is also past chair of the Subcommittee on Terrorism, Non-Proliferation, and Trade, and he is a senior member currently of the House Financial Services Committee. On this celebration of the 101st birthday of President Richard Milhouse Nixon, here in the home of Patriot, President, Peacemaker, I can think of no person I'd rather introduce than Patriot, Congressman, Peacemaker, Congressman Ed Royce. And Admiral, would you please join for the laying of the wreath?
Thank you very much, Mayor. Thank you, Sandy. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is good to be with you on a day like today to reflect on a leader who was very much a statesman of the 20th century, very much a man who was not only in the center of great world events, but who in fact himself shaped those events, who in fact had a strategy, had a very clear sense of America's role in the world. And I think for those of us who have thought about the sacrifice that his generation had made and the lessons that they had learned, you think about young Richard Nixon having watched a world in which the United States did not play a prominent role, but having watched evolve out of that what had happened in Germany with respect to the Third Reich, what had happened in Asia as Korea and China were overrun by Imperial Japan at the time, as fascism in Italy as Italy invaded Greece and then Africa, watching the world devolve into chaos. And then Richard Nixon being part of that generation that brought order out of chaos and had that clear sense of American exceptionalism, understood that bad ideas around the world had very bad consequences, had seen firsthand those consequences in Asia, knew of what had happened with the Holocaust, knew of the destabilization, the tragedy, the human tragedy that the world had been plunged into, and went back to throw himself into public life with a focus on foreign policy, something that is often ignored, but to Richard Nixon and to those of that generation, those statesmen of that generation, he felt it was important that we develop that vision, we develop that strategy, we exhibit that leadership. We do the hard thinking, and he did a lot of thinking throughout his life. He never stopped thinking about foreign policy, about the steps we should take in order to secure not just the security of this country, the safety of our fellow Americans, but also to make certain that never again we would have to confront what he confronted. And remember, when he became president, he faced a very unpopular war. He faced a very aggressive Soviet Union, a Soviet Union that was so assured of its own supremacy in this struggle that Khrushchev had said, "We will bury you," and they thought they would. Richard Nixon knew otherwise, but he knew that we needed a strategy not just for the United States, but also to work with our allies, to strengthen our role, and to see us through all of this. And so I think on what would be his 101st birthday, it is very good that we share these thoughts of a visionary statesman, a man well ahead of his time. I had an opportunity to hear the last speech he gave to the House of Representatives. In 1993, I'd just been elected to the House. He told me, "Hey, Ed Royce, you represent my old district. That's a mighty fine district." And I told him I had signed up on the Foreign Affairs Committee. So after he gave the speech on the House side, he invited me over for a speech he was going to give, again, without notes, to the members of the Senate in terms of the challenges that he felt were to face this country, and the steps that he thought. It was a speech to a bipartisan Senate. I was astounded at how many showed up, and it was not an advertised address. It was simply so that they could hear his thoughts. His achievements in foreign policy are not only important, but this is the 35th anniversary of the U.S.-China relationship, and for those of us who knew the public side of Richard Nixon, we respect his courage on pursuing policies which he felt would position the United States in the future in a way that would strengthen our role in the world. And while we tend to focus more on the public lives of our nation's presidents, there is, of course, a very important private side to every leader. And today, with Dr. Will Swift's excellent biography on not only Richard Nixon, but on his beloved wife, Pat Nixon, we have a better appreciation of him as a devoted husband, caring father, and an adoring grandfather. And I remember clearly the loving images of the Nixon family when I was going to school up the road here at Cal State Fullerton during Patricia Nixon's storybook wedding to Edward Cox at the White House in 1971. As chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, I see firsthand the tremendous impact of Nixon's foreign policy on our nation's relationships abroad. Just as Nixon focused much of his energy in opening up China, I too spend a significant part of my time working with China on some of our nation's most pressing problems. Frankly, many of these are pressing problems for this globe. And Nixon captured the essence of his historic visit to China by saying upon his return, "This was the week that changed the world by what we have said." But what we have said is not nearly as important as what we will do in the years ahead to build a bridge across 16,000 miles and 22 years of hostilities, which have divided us in the past. And what we have said today is that we shall build that bridge, and indeed, the President helped change the world. Later this year, I plan to invite China's ambassador to the U.S. to visit the Nixon Library as my guest, in recognition of that 35 years now of friendship between our two countries. And I know that if Richard Nixon was alive today, he would nod approvingly of how far our relationships have gone with Asia. And ladies and gentlemen, as we celebrate President Nixon's birthday, let us never forget just how much his legacy remains with us all today. Thank you again. Thank you especially, Sandy, for the invitation. And I look forward to hearing today from Dr. Swift.
Now we'll have the laying of the wreath from the President. And this is a symbolic gesture of recognition and respect. Gentlemen. Thank you both. And thank you to the Marines for participating as well. Thank you, sir. Now we're honored to have the author of Pat and Dick. And I've been working with him for, I guess, a year on this book, as have many of the Nixon friends and family. He is a presidential historian and biographer. He's a psychologist by profession. He's written for 25 years on American and British leaders, including the Roosevelts and the Royals. He's written a book about the Kennedys. And this book, as he will probably tell you, he decided to do something on a First Lady, and there hadn't been anything in depth written about Pat Nixon, so he chose this couple. Ladies and gentlemen, Will Swift.
First of all, thank you all for coming, and thank you so much to Sandy and the Foundation for inviting me. The book Pat and Dick literally came out on Tuesday, and this is the first talk I'm giving on it. And I wanted to say on a personal note that it is devoted and dedicated to my 3 wonderful grandchildren, Emerson, Piper, and Cole, and their very loving parents. And I also want to say that I'm delighted that my cousin Bill Swift and his family is here today to celebrate with us. I want to dedicate this talk to Julie and Tricia and Ed and David, who deserve to see their parents treated fairly. I think that Sandy has told me that the theme for this coming year is taking a new look at Richard Nixon. And that's a great context in which for me to tell you about this book, because by telling the story of Richard Nixon through the humanizing perspective of his wife and his marriage, his strengths are clarified and his weaknesses are put in a new perspective. In 1948, when Richard Nixon was a member of the House Un-American Activities Committee, and he was investigating Alger Hiss for communism, he never dreamed that 24 years later, he would be in China, opening China to the West. It's extraordinary when you take a life journey and you have a sense of adventure in your heart and curiosity and openness and follow what's emerging rather than keep to a rigid path, what changes you can make. And I have a confession to make to you all today along that line. In 1969, I was a graduate student at the University of Texas in Austin. And what do you think I was doing? I was protesting the Vietnam War and Richard Nixon. And on that day, I had no idea that I would be here today celebrating Richard Nixon and his marriage. So things do change. You know, as a psychologist, I bring a unique perspective to this, as well as a historian and a biographer, because I've been working, believe it or not, I've been working for doing marital therapy with couples since 1970. That's a long time. And one of the things I've always been fascinated by is long-term marriages and all that they shift and go through. So you think of a couple in courtship, they're like this. And over the period of a marriage, one person individuates and becomes interested in new developing careers and things, and they move away apart. And then the other partner moves off to something else, and there's a dance and a rhythm in a relationship. And I think that we see this in the Nixon marriage. And I would like to maintain that too many people see the Nixon marriage through the lens of Watergate. And that's simply not a fair and accurate lens to see a 53-year relationship. So I'm going to talk about 3 main myths that still crop up about the Nixons and their marriage. And I'm going to tell you some of the things I found. One of the things I'm not going to be able to have time to do is to tell you about the wonderful relationship with the Eisenhowers, which is much better than people say, but you can read that in the book. So one of the myths about Richard Nixon is that he was a cold or uncaring husband. And I think one of the things that I found is that he was very sentimental. In 1944, on the 6th anniversary of meeting Pat, he wrote her a letter from the South Pacific in which he said, "Your birthday is today, and I'm going to celebrate all your birthdays as a remembrance of our happiness and my love for you." And he always followed through on that. And I was told a wonderful story by Lucy Winchester, the social secretary in the White House. In March 1969, when Richard Nixon was besieged by all the things he had to do in the Vietnam War, he called Lucy into a meeting, and she had no idea what he was going to say. It was also always a little nervous to meet the president and see what he's up to. And he said, "We are going to throw a surprise birthday party for Pat. And I am going to tell you in exact detail how I planned it. She is going to enter, and she's going to stand at the north end of the East Room. And he went through all the details, and he proceeded to get so excited that he began to sing Happy Birthday, and he sang the entire song, Happy Birthday, as if he were the band and conducting the birthday right then. And that showed what great enthusiasm he had for celebrating his wife. And interesting enough, he didn't care much about celebrating his own birthday. And so that was, I think, a very interesting insight that I got into him. And the other thing that I think is very important is to see some of the letters he wrote her during the war. I just want to quote a few of them because there's a tender aspect to Richard Nixon's heart. And Frank Gannon interviewed him a number of years ago, and Frank said, "What's written on your heart?" In a split second, he said, "Pat." There was no hesitation. So this is what he wrote her at a couple points during the war. "I'm certainly not the Romeo type. I may not say much when I'm with you, but all of me loves all of you all the time." Pat, whose nickname for her husband was Plum, wrote back at 2 o'clock in the morning, "I just had to write you to say how very much I love you." She had seen a movie, but told him, "I miss Plum's hand very much." In 1943, he was in a Quonset hut, and he wrote her on their third anniversary, "I'm thinking of our years together and loving you every minute of the time." Then thinking about his wife's wartime job in San Francisco at the Office of Price Administration, he wrote her, "I'm really very proud, as I've always been. I like to tell the guys how smart you are, as well as being the most attractive person they'll ever see. Dear heart, you are the tops. Small wonder that I have no other interest but you." And one other example. In early 1944, he wrote, "Dear one, what fun we could have on a farm." He wrote her, "Dogs, horses, snow, and somebody to do the work. Whatever it is, whatever you do, it will be wonderful to be with you again. I love you so very, very much this minute." This is a tenderness that you don't often hear about. I want to take you back to the beginning of their courtship to give you another view on that. And Frank Gannon, who has wonderful expressions, said that Richard Nixon was the man who thought he had no game but had won the hot girl. And that's basically how he thought of it all his life. So I want to read you just briefly from the book to give you a feel in January 1938 when they met, where they were. The first year of their courtship was very uneven. And Pat was much more grounded, and she really had a sense of happiness in her professional life. She was in her first year teaching at Whittier High School, teaching business, and she'd had a sense of privation and a lot of sacrifice in her family life after her parents died, and she wasn't ready to get married or really involved with someone. So I want to just read briefly. Miss Ryan was a sophisticated modern woman. Lithe and graceful, she wore fashionable skirts with bright blouses and sweaters that set off her luxuriant red gold hair, her fresh complexioned face, and her high cheekbones. And she wore lavender perfume. Student Robert Blake remembered that Miss Ryan was quite a dish. You could kid around with her, Virginia Endicott remembered, but there was always that fine line you do not cross. Beneath her accommodating demeanor lay a steely fortitude, forged from years of hardship, toil, and unstinting effort to better herself. And this is the part I love. Suddenly, junior and senior boys were becoming interested in learning how to type. They were signing up for a typing class. This was the first. Many teenage boys in her class developed infatuations, while female students developed schoolgirl crushes on her. Young Pat Ryan was discovering the price of glamour in a dull community. She was being wooed to the point of harassment by her many admirers, including her students. Some of the boys in her class placed a small query in the student paper asking where she lived and were able to locate her apartment. They followed her to the one stucco bungalow court where she lived on Hadley Street across from the bowling alley. Summoning up their nerve, they knocked on her door, but they received a mighty cool reception from Miss Ryan, who was not only intent on maintaining her professional demeanor, but preternaturally guarded, even secretive. Groups of girls staked out her apartment, eager to flesh out the fantasies of her exhilarating life. One evening, in an eerie harbinger of the intrusive intention that would become commonplace in the public life of Mrs. Richard Nixon, Pat returned home from a date and walked to her door in the glare of headlights fixed upon her from a car of young admirers. So this is what Nixon was competing with. And by contrast, at the beginning of January 1938, 25-year-old Dick Nixon found his native ambition blocked. He was living in a small room over his parents' garage. He was working in a job he'd been reluctant to take. He did not have a girlfriend, and he was back home in the town he had tried to leave behind. After placing third in his graduating class at Duke Law School, he'd been disappointed when prominent East Coast law firms had turned down his job applications. His mother, Hannah, had pulled some strings to have her friend Tom Bewley offer Dick a job as an associate at Wingert and Bewley, Whittier's most reputable law firm. Here's Nixon, and he's just beginning his career, and here's Pat, and she's just having the best time. Well, with his trademark persistence, he pursued her. But after 6 months, Pat, who really wanted to let him know she didn't want to get involved, what did she do? She went to Michigan to buy a car, and she disappeared from his life for 3 months. Well, he didn't like that. So finally in September, he heard she was back, and he wrote her a letter saying, "I'd like to see you if you could stand me, and I promise it will never be boring." And he was certainly right about that. It was never boring with his life with her. Well, one of the things that's a thrill for a biographer is when you have a moment where you can stand in the shoes of the person that you're writing about. And Myra Hilliard of the Whittier Historical Society arranged for me to go up in the office where Richard Nixon worked as a young attorney. And what I was really impressed by was that he could look out the window and he could see Whittier High School. And I could imagine him looking over there and sort of dreaming of Pat and yearning to see her. And I also found in looking through his daily diaries that toward the end of the year, he began to make little notations at the bottom of pages that recorded her comments that were beginning to show that she had interest. She said, "I'm lonesome for you," one day in December. Another day, I'm glad you came. And he was thrilled, and it was so important to him, he wrote these things down. Richard Nixon told Frank Gannon that he thinks he won her, finally, at the football game on New Year's Day at the Rose Bowl because their alma maters were playing. Duke had been undefeated and unscored upon that year, and Pat's USC came back at the last minute to beat them 7-3. Well, this was the kind of thrilling moment that a reticent woman probably could reach over and take the hand of her determined date. And that was the moment when things began to shift. And there was a time in April, a few months later, when suddenly she began to write him romantic missives. She wrote to him and said, "Why don't you come over Wednesday at 6? I'll try to burn you a hamburger." Which that comment, by the way, shows the wit that she has throughout her letters. Have you seen the sunsets? A new picture every moment. Well, yes, Pat. So she was beginning to have that wonderful feeling. And he pursued her, and one of the things he did, and this is trademark Richard Nixon, he couldn't stand ice skating. He couldn't ice skate for his life. But what did he do? He knew she liked to ice skate, so he practiced, and he bloodied himself falling down on the ice repeatedly, but he was determined he was going to be able to go out and ice skate with her and her friends. And he did. Well, eventually, with his persistence, she began to see what a wonderful sense of adventure he had. She always admired his brilliant mind, and he transmitted to her that he had a high sense of purpose, and this was very important to her. And one of the things we don't really think about as much with Pat is a sense of purpose was as important to her as it was to Richard Nixon, and was one of the reasons they got together. So they were married in 1940 after he proposed on the most romantic cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean, and it was literally the day before the Nazis came up the Champs-Élysées and took over Paris. So it was a very difficult time. So that's to give you a feel for the courtship. Now, a second myth about Pat is that she was a weak or passive person compared to her husband. And this is decidedly not true. One of the goals of my book is really to restore her to her full place as Richard Nixon's teammate and partner. In 1946, they were one of the first political couples to run together in an election, really a result of the wartime work that women had done. And Pat was very much a teammate, and more so than any other campaign with Dick. It was a long uphill battle to win this. Jerry Voorhees had been in for 10 years, and they were not funded at all. They had an abandoned storefront. Tricia was born in February. They had almost no sleep, no money, and until they won a primary and got the endorsement of Los Angeles Times, they had no money. But they were absolutely determined. Pat was the campaign manager. She went out, she rang doorbells, she got volunteers, and she was very teary. She told the Saturday Evening Post, when people would come in and say, we want to support you, we don't really have any money, but here's a $50, here's $1. And so she was the backbone, because there were many discouraging moments for Richard Nixon. He would sometimes despair, and she was always there with the optimism. Nixon, of course, performed brilliantly in the debates with Voorhees. I think he said, Voorhees said later, the fray was ready for me, but I was not ready for the fray. And when they finally won the election in November 1946, Richard Nixon wrote in his memoir, we were happier on that day than we ever were at any other time in our political life. And once again, I went to his date book, and what did I see scrawled in huge letters? Victory. It meant so much to them. Pat in 1948 sort of backed off because she now had Julie, and while he was investigating Alger Hiss, he went through a very difficult time trying to make these decisions. He had terrible time sleeping, and by his own admission in his memoir, he was miserable to live with, but she supported him all the way and helped him through that. In 1950, when he ran for the Senate, they drove all over California in a wood-paneled station wagon. She passed out 65,000 thimbles saying, "Safeguard America." She was very strong. And of course, the most memorable, which many of you probably know about, is the funds scandal crisis, where Eisenhower had picked them as the vice presidential couple. They were starting their campaign in Pomona, and they were going to take Nixon's special train up the coast, and they were very excited. And as they went along in the train, which had no outside communication, they would stop at a particular town, and only then could they go to the phone and find out, and they began to hear that the New York Post had charged them with having a wealthy slush fund and being unethical. And of course, the main thing in this campaign was going against the corruption of the Truman administration. This was devastating. It was such a jittery thing. It was almost an oppressive thing being in that train, because every stop the news got worse. More and more newspapers were decrying Nixon, calling for him to resign and get off the ticket. By one night at 2 in the morning in Medford, Oregon, he woke Pat up and he said, I think I should resign. And she said to him, "You cannot resign. Eisenhower will lose. If you run away, you'll be scarred for the rest of your life, and you'll destroy yourself." And he said, "Okay, I guess I'll continue in the campaign." And then there was the moment, a famous moment, when after he decided to address on national television the American audience to make his case, he'd been preparing feverishly for 48 hours, just completely exhausted. And just before he went up on stage at the theater to be filmed, he said, "I don't think I can do it." And what did Pat say? "Yes, you can." She grabbed his hand and took him up to the stage. So, and while she sat there listening, she said herself that she sat like a wax-like figure, because she was so afraid that if she would lose control and be emotional, and she knew the camera was panned on her. And so this was the beginning of what this rigid control that she had to have during this time was the beginning of what people started to call plastic Pat. And Nixon's response was, "Her plastic is tougher than the toughest steel. He always thought of her as the stronger partner and his backbone. And it meant so much to him. And they went through the various crises of their lives, the Caracas when they were almost killed and their limousines were turned over, in the last year in the White House, in the first years in La Casa Pacifica in retirement, where they both had illnesses that almost killed them. She was always there for him. So this idea that she was not a strong partner. And there's one anecdote I love. When they were in Africa in 1957 representing Eisenhower, the temperature was over 100 degrees. She was in a stinking market. It was almost intolerable conditions. And suddenly she was presented with this big, ugly fisheye. And the tradition was that the guest ate it. So she just plopped it in her mouth, swallowed it down, without even flinching. And General Don Hughes, who was with her for the first time, looked at her and said, "What's going on?" She said, "This is just the way we do it." So it's quite a bit of strength there. The final myth that I want to talk about is the myth that they had a miserable marriage. And in fact, 5 years ago in Boston, I was going to switch agents, and I talked to an agent and said, "I'd like to do the Nixon marriage." "Oh," she said, "that's a dreadful story. You shouldn't do that at all. That's the last thing you should do." But I didn't give up, and I went and found a great agent who said, "No, it's a wonderful story." So in our American culture, we really celebrate extroverts. We foster public displays of affection, and we encourage the idea that, if a relationship's gone through difficult times, you can give up on it. So in this context, of course, the American press and public have a difficult time understanding the spacious, independent, private, and committed relationship the Nixons have. Now, I don't mean to glorify their relationship. Look, they went through dark times like any other couple. They drove each other crazy at times. They had many times that were difficult. 1948, 1960 when they lost the election to Kennedy, 1962 when Pat did not want Dick Nixon to run for governor of California, and of course the last period in Watergate. And so there was, like any other marriage, any other long-term marriage, there was ambivalence, there was resentments, but this is par for the course. And one of the things that you all should do, if you get a chance, is read Pat's letters to her dear friend Helene Drown, because there you get a distinct sense of her personality. She wrote to Helene once, "I love your letters. I just light up," i.e. a cigarette, "I light up, sit back, and devour." And like many women who would share with their friends, she would complain about Richard Nixon, about how he just didn't like to mow the lawn. And she, in fact, said, "He said he's going to do it next week. I'll telegraph you when it happens." She said, "I got him to," another letter, "I got him to mow the lawn. And guess what? He's been complaining of sore hands ever since." So he didn't really like to do those chores. And she said, "If a nail has to be driven in this household, it's me that does the nail driving." And there were times that she was very lonely, let's face it. He was off on the road a lot. But she wrote Helene, "I'm alone. It's Saturday night, and I'm alone again. But I'm accustomed to it now." And the fact is that Pat, by nature of her personality and upbringing, was a very independent woman. And she was able to have that sense of distance at times and tolerate it in a way that many other wives would not have been able to. Tolstoy said that it is not so much a lack of compatibility that makes a good happy marriage, but it's the ability to deal with incompatibility. And I think that's a crucial fact that people miss when they talk about the Nixon marriage. There were incompatibilities because we all know that Pat didn't love politics the way Dick did, but they found very creative ways of managing that. And I think one of the things that we don't give enough credit to and focus on is the extraordinary period in the vice presidency when they traveled the world representing Eisenhower. The press called Pat a phenomenon of our time, a diplomat in high heels. She found a way, and this is again another very important point. While he was assessing the communist influence in different parts of the Far East, and he was reporting to Eisenhower what was going on and connecting, she found a role in supporting women, and this was a very important theme in her life that I don't think has been acknowledged enough, where she would go, and she wasn't like Eleanor Roosevelt, who gave all these lectures about human rights and women's rights. She did it by personal example, by getting women invited to events that they'd never been invited to all over the Far East, by meeting them and encouraging them, going to the various places where they were and helping them. She did this all the time. This was her way of taking politics and making it hers. And Richard and Pat Nixon believed very much in the myth of American mission, divinely ordained to be examples of justice and freedom throughout the world, and to help people to recognize that they can have liberty and democracy. And this sense of purpose was very, very ingrained in them. Finally, I'd say that one of the myths is that Richard Nixon's public treatment of his wife in the White House years was a reflection of their private relationship. People often commented on the fact that when they were out in public doing political events, he would be off here, she would be off there, and people wanted this couple to be holding hands and be like this. But that's not how they operated. Richard Nixon saw the political arena as an arena, a gladiatorial arena, and he was not interested in vulnerability or showing intimacy. He was interested, and Pat was too, in accomplishing what they had to accomplish. There were times when the Secret Service agents wondered, why do they not talk to each other on the helicopter? Why do they go for walks and seem not to talk? And Richard Nixon believed that very strongly that there was emotional, chemical, almost mystical aspect to a relationship that could be felt deeply between the two partners, even if they weren't talking. And I think that's a very important explanation of what's going on. People who were close to them saw them as playful with each other. They nagged each other. They joked around. The president was given King Timoko as a dog, drove Pat crazy because Nixon would let the dog get on the furniture, and Pat just drove her crazy to see the dog hairs on the furniture. On the other hand, Pat was not always prompt. There was a famous incident at San Clemente at the heliport where Nixon was literally seen tapping his foot because Pat was running late. So they were a normal couple in many ways in that. And we come to the White House years, and every presidential couple struggles because there is a battle between the West Wing people who represent the president and the East Wing women who represent the First Lady. And that conflict is played out, and it's amazing that none of our presidential couples have been divorced because the pressures are intense. And sometimes Richard Nixon drove Pat crazy because he liked to be involved in every aspect, including of state dinners, planning the menus, everything down to the entertainment and the menus. And of course, she and her people wanted to do it themselves. But the other thing that impressed me and I was very touched by is how protective Richard Nixon was of Pat in the White House years. There were articles in the paper claiming she was a sort of a failure as a first lady, very traditional, and even complaining that she was seen stuffing envelopes. And he would gather in the personnel and say, now we got to put out press releases saying all the wonderful things she's done for underprivileged people. She has had such an amazing career. And they were, in 1969, when the Nixons were about to go on a tour of Europe, there was an article in the New York Times, a very famous article, in which Judith Viorst, the columnist, stated, the Nixon marriage is dry as dust. Well, Pat and Dick worked together to do documentaries to counter these kinds of accusations in the press. And there was a documentary that was made of this trip called Mrs. Nixon's Journey, showing her going through orphanages and showing how full-hearted and engaged she was with other people. And when it was played on television, Richard Nixon stamped his fist on the table and said, that's right, that's who you are, that's how they have to see you. And Pat called up Nancy Dickerson to tell her how thrilled he was to see her in that way. And as the White House years went on, Pat developed her own independent role as First Lady. Nixon sent her to Peru for the first time. A First Lady went on a humanitarian mission to help people who'd had an earthquake there. She actually showed the First Lady of Peru how to get in the ruins, almost like Queen Elizabeth during the Blitz, and comfort people. In 1972, she went on her own trip to Africa, and she was the first Lady to represent a president at an official inauguration, the president of Liberia. She addressed the Ghanaian Assembly. She discussed policy with a number of heads of states. So she was emerging. One of the tragedies of Watergate is that Pat Nixon was emerging as a high-level diplomat. I think she could have been like Jean Kennedy Smith, an ambassador to a country, had not the Watergate crisis happened. Now I just want to talk a little bit about the end of their lives. Pat came down with lung cancer in the 1990s. Nixon was devastated. Monica Crowley, his foreign policy assistant, said he wasn't able to finish sentences. He walked along aimlessly in the corridors. He couldn't seem to handle it. Finally, Pat came close to death, and supposedly his last words to her, Pat, as she was very frail and leaning in a chair, was, "Your family loves you, your country loves you, and people all over the world love you." Shortly thereafter, she went into a coma and died. And if you've never seen the video of Pat Nixon's funeral, it's extraordinary. Richard Nixon, a man who never wanted to be vulnerable in public, was inconsolable. He couldn't stop his weeping. He took handkerchiefs to cover his mouth, but he was completely undone because she had been the only one for him. And after the funeral, he went up to greet the Reagans, and he leaned on Nancy Reagan's chest and wept. Several days later, back in New Jersey, Crowley found him, and he said, "There's no one here. There's silence. My God." And at the funeral, someone had told Leonard Garment, one of his attorneys, Richard Nixon is not going to last a year. He died 8 months after Pat did. And one of the great moments at his funeral, that a lot of you may remember, is that President Clinton came and he said, "May the day of judging President Nixon on less than his whole life be ended." And I would like to, and of course you may remember that President Clinton was a war protester, and his wife was on the Watergate committee. So for him to say that was extraordinary. So from one Watergate Vietnam protester to another, I'd like to join Clinton in saying, may we no longer use Richard Nixon's marriage against him. People could disagree with his policies, they can disagree with his politicking, and they can disagree with the way he used or abused power in the White House, but leave his marriage alone. It was one of the great accomplishments of his life. And I think today we should celebrate the qualities in that marriage, the loyalty, the persistence, the sense of adventure and curiosity and high purpose, and the willingness to forgive each other and to move through dark periods. The Nixons always said that when they had difficult times, rather than fight, they moved apart for a while, and then they came back together. So let's celebrate these qualities. And finally, I just want to say in closing that the Nixon marriage, rife with strengths and weaknesses, reinventing itself in crisis after crisis, endured in public life for a half a century. Their story is central to our story, and it is emblematic of the American story. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Will, and he will be available for a book signing immediately after the program in the museum store, and it's an excellent book, and I hope you'll pick it up and get him to inscribe it and sign it for you. Ladies and gentlemen, please stand for the taps. Thank you. That's musician first class David Harajuk. Thank you, sir. Thank you again to the Navy Region Southwest Band. Thanks to all of you for coming. Please join Will Swift in the lobby and pick up one of his books. Thank you for coming.